So the next concept we need to talk about is yield to maturity. So in a bond, we use the market interest rates to discount the cash flows to today and then add up the present value of all those cash flows to find the price. But in reality, that's backwards from what actually happens, right? So we actually know prices, but we don't know the interest rate that gave us those prices. And so this is a one equation, one unknown situation, right? Because we have our pricing equation with a bunch of cash flows, and that uses interest rate in the denominator. It's just the same one over and over again. And so we can ask, well, if we apply the same interest rate to all the money, what interest rate makes sense? What interest rate would that be? And so we get an equation something like this, where we have cash right there, and sorry, this should be 108.5 there on the end. So 8.5, 8.5, 108.5, and we want to know how we get to 120.44. So we solve for y. Now, if you've ever tried to find the zeros of a cubic polynomial, it isn't very fun. You could do some synthetic division. There is a cubic formula, but again, there's only the only practical formulas are the quadratic formula and the cubic formula, and there are no formulas much past that. That's a proven fact, and there never will be. And so really the reality is solving for this using algebra is not really practical for normal applications, and so we need to find a solution in Excel. So that's what we'll do now. So we'll kick over to Excel here. And so we've got those cash flows, right? We have 8.5, 8.5, 108.5. So I'm going to take the present value of those. So I'll do 8.5 divided by 1 plus R. There's my R cell. And I'll lock it in with F4 or Command T in a Mac to the power of the year. So we'll say that's here. And I'll drag these to the right. So then as I add the years and then add the interest rate, so I'm just going to put a guess rate in there. And then sum these up. We get 96. Okay, so what do we know about our guess interest rate? If the market rate was indeed 10%, this bond would trade for 96%. 96% of face, so $962. That is too low, right? We know that it actually trades for 120.44. So we need to try a lower interest rate. What about 4%? 3, 2, 1. 1.5. Oh, getting close. Here, let's 1.45. Did it go in the right direction or the wrong direction? Let's see, what do we need? We want 120.44. So now we're just a little too expensive. Let's try 1.46. 1.48. Oh, pretty close. 1.49. Ooh, 1.485. Oh, really close. So what I'm doing here is, it's kind of crudely the bisection method, right? You go above and below and just work your way down using guess and check. So there's a faster way to do that. So if we go into Excel and do solver, you can see that dialog here. And we're going to say, hey, let's make this cell right here a value of 120.44 by changing the interest rate. And we say go, and it found it, 1.4835%. Okay, so that is us finding the missing interest rate, right? It was the interest rate we didn't know that gave us the right price here. And so this interest rate, the interest rate that if we applied that rate to every cash flow of a bond, you get the accurate price. That's called the yield to maturity. And the idea is if I hold this bond to the end of its life, the return I get on my money would be 1.4835%, right? I put 120 in, 120.44 in, I get 850, 850, and 108.50. And so those payments back imply a certain interest rate. We can also do the same procedure with the financial calculator. So we'll say, we know what the present value is. It's like 120.44. And the future value is 100. And then our payments are 850. And we have 3 total payments. And we calculate and see 1484, 1484, right? Just rounds one more digit than Excel did. Okay, so we can use the financial calculator to find yield to maturity as well. You just need to give it the price, the payment at the end of the lump sum at the end of the life of the bond, the payments along the way, and then the number of payments we're receiving. So yeah, either way works. And yield is important because yield is how we price compare bonds, right? If I have a bond that has, if it's a different cash flows but the same length of time, I can look at the yields and decide roughly whether one bond is trading rich or trading cheap, or it can show me where the default risk is, right? Which bonds have a higher default risk. And so those are all pretty important uses of yield to maturity. And bonds are often quoted in yield. I mean, they're quoted in price too, but they'll usually quote the yield as well. If you go to Morningstar and look up a company that has corporate bonds, they'll actually show you a grid that shows the maturity on the x-axis and the yield on the y-axis, and there's little bubbles to show how much dollar value of debt for the company it has at all these different yield levels. And it helps you get an overall cost of debt capital for the company. And so, so that is yield, and it's an important return concept in bonds. Another important yield concept is yield to call. This is because some bonds can be called back by the issuer, right? They say we don't want these bonds anymore. We want to pay them off and get new bonds, and so they'll call them back. And so if that happens, your interest rate that you get might actually be different, because if interest rates fall, the company will be interested in issuing new debt at the lower rates, and so they'll call them back. And so yield to maturity would only be your return if you hold the bond to maturity and it isn't called. So a yield to call assumes the bond gets called in, usually at the earliest possible moment, but you could put in other potential call-in times and get a return. Okay, so that's yield. So the next concept we're going to talk about is duration. This is the risk of a bond. Okay, and let me just show you something. Just show you a really simple demonstration of what's going on with duration. So if I go ahead into Excel, and I'm going to do 2 different bonds, okay? I'm going to do a bond that's going to pay $1,000 in 1 year, and I'm going to do a bond that pays $1,000 in 40 years. Okay, and I'll do the present value either way, right? So this divided by 1 plus r, and we'll put our r over here, to the n. All right, and let's give us a 2% interest rate. Okay, there we go. obviously, right? Obviously, this is going to be worth more than this because 1 year from now is a lot closer than 40 years from now. But let me just show you something. So if you think about this, right, this formula is actually 1 plus r to the 40 on the bottom here. Okay, so let's just copy these. I'm going to paste them as values. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the interest rate a little bit. So let's paste them as values here. And this was the 2%. So what if I change this to be 2.1%? Okay, I get new values. Obviously, when the interest rates rise, the bond prices will drop because interest rates rising means returns on bonds need to rise, which means you need to be able to buy them cheaper to get the better returns. Okay, but let's look at the price change that happens here. So if I do this divided by this, right, I get a 0.1% price change, right? That's a very small price change. It's $1 on $1,000. Now look at this one. It's about 4%. Okay, 0.1% versus 4%. Okay, so think what that means. If I was to look at the volatility of prices for these bonds, if I look at how much the prices move, this bond is not going to move very much when interest rates change, and this bond is going to move a lot when interest rates change. And prices that move a lot, we have a name for that. If we have a financial security whose price changes a lot, we call it risky. Right? A risky security has prices that move up and down a lot. And so if I have, a risky security is one I'm not as excited about holding as a safe security. And that means that to get me to hold it, to get me to own it, you're going to have to pay me a premium, right? I'm going to have to get even more money to own this one, right? This time value of money is not going to be enough because I would never do it. If I'm just going to get 2.1%, I might as well get 2.1% in a safe bond. I wouldn't do it in a risky bond. And so the result of that is that for bonds, the longer it takes for you to get your money, the riskier the bond is. And that means that risk in bonds can be measured in time. And that is what duration is as a concept. It says, let's take all the present value of all the cash and let's figure out how many years it takes to get our money back on average. You actually multiply the present value in a given year times the year and then divide by the total value of the bond, and that gives you it's essentially a weighted average of time. So if I have half my money in year 1 and half my money in year 3 in present value terms, then that bond would have a duration of 2, right? Because half of it's 1 year money, half of it's 3 year money, it would have a duration of 2 years, and that would mean it's about as risky as other 2-year bonds with the same credit quality. Okay, and that's just kind of an interesting concept that risk is measured as in time in the bonds world. And that's important. It also means that if you think about interest rates, right, the longer the interest rate, the higher it should be because we're demanding a risk premium. And that's what happens normally in a well-functioning economy. If you look at interest rates, short-term interest rates are low and long-term interest rates are high. And you may have encountered that if you've ever gone mortgage shopping. So if you've noticed, right, a 15-year mortgage is almost always cheaper than a 30-year mortgage. And you may have wondered, well, why does how long I take to pay it off really matter for how much my interest rate is? And you could probably make the argument, well, if I'm paying it off faster, that's less of a risk to the bank. And that's true, right? A lot can happen to your earning capacity over 30 years. A lot can happen over 15, but more can happen over 30. And so there is an element of that. But the reality is most people make more money as their career goes on. So in terms of credit quality, usually it increases over time rather than decreases. And even if it did decrease somewhat, that wouldn't be really the driving factor. So really what it is, really the reason that a 15-year mortgage has a lower interest rate than a 30-year mortgage typically is because longer maturity payments have more interest rate risk. And so the bank, who has to bear the risk, right, because you don't, as the mortgage holder, you pay the same payment every month. You don't have to bear any interest rate risk. They do. They have the risk, and so they're going to charge you for it. So they will charge you a bigger interest rate on a longer mortgage to compensate them for bearing the risk. And that's not even really exactly true, because often the bank just sells the loan that they originate for you, but the market price of those loans depends on the time to maturity, right? So if the bank originates a 30-year mortgage, it's going to have to sell it for less than if they originated a 15-year mortgage. But it ends up being a wash because they have to charge you less as well, and so it ends up being an equilibrium, the concept we've talked about before. Okay, so that is, and so let me just, so there's just one, I have some slides on how to calculate duration. If that's something you want to look more into, they're available on the course page. The last concept I want to talk about is the term structure of interest rates. So we just have kind of had a little bit of cognitive dissonance just now, because when we've been working with interest rates, there's always been one rate, right? When we find the price of a bond, we used the interest rate, right, in quotes, the interest rate. And when we did yield to maturity, we found the interest rate. And then I just said that the longer it is, the higher the rate should be. So in reality, we don't just have one rate. There's actually a rate for every time period you're looking to borrow from. So here's an example of market rates. They're from two different time periods in recent history. And you can see, right, the 1 month interest rate here is 0.01%. Now, this isn't 1%, it's 0.01% per year. So borrowing money for 1 month is almost free. Whereas if you borrow money for 30 years, it's 2.76%. Now this is the federal government borrowing money, so our rates are not that good. But you can see, right, there's a very clear picture. We start small and we get bigger. We start small and we get bigger. In normally function market, this always happens. So the only time it doesn't, we make a big deal about it in the financial press. We say, ooh, the yield curve is inverted. Maybe that's something you've heard before. The yield curve is inverted. That means that short-term rates are higher than long-term rates. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody be willing to invest at long-term rates when they could invest at short-term rates, which are less risky, and get more money? That doesn't make sense, right? So it does make sense in the following situation. If we invest at short-term rates, once our short-term rate ends, we have to reinvest at the new short-term rate, right? You have to roll it over. And if we believe that interest rates are going to crash, right? If we believe that short-term rates are going to go from wherever they are to nothing, then I don't want to invest at that short rate, because yes, I will make more money over the next month and then miss out on 30 years of money, right? I'll make a little bit money now and then regret it for the rest of my life, okay? If we are that confident that short-term rates are going to fall, we are going to invest in long-term securities instead, right? We go, well, let's get a 30-year lock in some decent interest rates now. Then when interest rates crash, we can sell our 30-year bond, or we can just hold it until interest rates come back, or whatever it is we're going to do. Okay, so that means that an inverted yield curve is a very strong signal by the market that short-term rates are going to fall. And that's not a good sign, right? Short-term rates fall because our economy is crashing and the Federal Reserve is adjusting their interest rate targets to try to stimulate the economy, right? So an inverted yield curve is considered a very strong signal that economic slowdown is coming. But in a normal universe, we have this yield curve, and so if this were an actual fixed income class, and I've taught those to master students, when we are pricing bonds, what we would do is we would line up the cash flows with the appropriate interest rate. So if I get paid in a year, I would use the 0.12% rate, and then if I get paid in 2 years, I would use the 0.24% rate for that cash flow, and so on. So you do a present value just like you're used to, but you have a different rate every time. Okay. Now that's a level of complexity that we don't really need to worry about. You don't have any problems like that or anything. But it's important to be aware that it exists, and actually anytime you use interest rates, you really should know the year of the interest rate that you're using, and then you would look it up in the yield curve for what you would need. Okay, so in fact, bond pricing is very complicated. Often people working in bonds may have PhDs in physics. They are computational engineering, advanced statistics. I mean, bond pricing is probably can be the most quantitative, career choice in finance. I mean, there are now. I mean, derivatives can be very complicated, and increasingly we can think about commodities pricing. If you were trying to predict future commodities prices, that could get very involved. But kind of the traditional playground of quants was in the bond market, and that's where the early successful hedge funds had a lot of famous transactions in the bond market. So that's it for bond pricing and yields and duration. Obviously this is a traded security. That's a valuable and educational example of applying a time value of money framework to something real, right? We can think about potential projects and checking accounts, but this is an actual security that we can benchmark against real prices and see how it does. And in fact, it does very well, right? So this is a justification, evidence in real life that the time value of money framework is effective at doing what it claims to do.